This is 17-year-old Jonathan Lewis. He has a younger friend. That younger friend was stolen from and thrown into a trash can by a group of 15 boys. So he stood up for his younger friend, and the 15 boys beat him to death for it. My question would be for the media that's barely covered this at all. Why aren't y'all calling this a hate crime?
Ooh, keep that same energy when the next person is black.
They do. They riot, they loot, they burn. But look at us. We're going about it the right way. We're getting justice the right way.
Oh, this guy named Jonathan Lewis got jumped by a bunch of basketball Americans at school, and most big news companies haven't even mentioned it. So, yeah, that goes to show you the hierarchy of what the news will talk about and what they won't.
So I've been gone for about 2 months now, and a lot of that has been due to stuff going on in my personal life and pressures and stress from school, obviously. But I've also been putting a lot of pressure on myself to make sure that the first thing I came back and talked about was what's going on in Israel and Palestine right now. And while I am fully of the opinion that the Palestinian people should have the right to determine their own future away from Israeli influence, and that Israel defending itself is not the same thing as killing over 10 times the amount of people that were killed on the October 7th terrorist attack already, whilst dropping over 6,000 bombs in 6 days, on a population center in which half of them are children, all for the unobtainable goal of completely eradicating a terrorist group, which is impossible considering the ideologies underpinning it are going to be strengthened if people keep settling and bombing and all types of bullshit. I am not as fully educated and ready enough to talk to you guys at length about the topic as I would want to be. I've been spending a lot of time learning more and more about the history of the region and everything going on, so when I am ready to talk to you guys about it fully, I will do so. Jonathan Lewis was a 17-year-old high school student who was beaten and killed by 15 other students at his school when he tried to get something back that these people had stolen from one of his friends. Shortly after his death, and despite his father, who spoke to the media, not making any single insinuation about anything having to do with race, conservative media, ever being the critics of people who invoked the race card, invoked the race card and tried to use it as proof of anti-white bias, seeing as,
I almost can guarantee you if it was a bunch of white guys beating on a black guy, the whole world would know about this incident. But since it's a white guy, it just gets blown undercover pretty much.
Now let's peel back the sheer stupidity and woeful ignorance present in all of these talking points, beginning with the timeline of events.
It happened on November 1st, and it is now November 15th. And we're barely hearing shit about it.
This is the first component of the argument, and this really sets up the rest of it. Because if they can establish that something bad happened to somebody that would get national news coverage if it happened to a black person, and it's not getting coverage right now, the only thing that's different must be because it happened to a white person. So it begins to fall apart if you start asking, well, did it get national news coverage? So I went all the way back in the timeline. The very first news article at all talking about this situation was posted November 9th, 2023. The actual attack that resulted in his death happened on November 1st, and he passed away on November 7th. 3 days later, the not reputable but more known New York Post picks up on the story. That same day, Fox News, not reputable but very known, picks up on the story. 2 days after that, USA Today picks up on the story. 1 day after that, it was in the New York Times. That same day, Yahoo News posted via The Independent. Also November 15th, that same day, Reuters picks up on the story, breaking at the time that 8 teenagers had been arrested for the killing of Jonathan Lewis. That same day, the Associated Press picks up on the story, and the next day, CNN picks up on the story. So just as a recap, Jonathan Lewis was attacked on the 1st, passed away on the 7th, his father went to the media on the 9th, and then within a week of his father talking to the media, all different types of news outlets, including the New York Times, CNN, and USA Today, all reported on what happened to him. I ask, how in the fuck is this not national news coverage? Now let's move to level 2, that being historical context. Even if I accept the premise that
The hypocrisy is astounding, because if this was 15 white boys brutally beating a single black boy to death, there'd already be marches in the streets, and Joe Biden would have been sent that family flowers.
have any of you earnestly stopped to ask yourself why that is? Is it hypocrisy and we just don't care about white people no more? Or is it because the status of race relations is not, nor has it ever been, determined by black people in the United States? As a way to further illustrate what I'm talking about, let's talk about the past, which I know y'all fucking hate. If we can see, let's just say 200 years of history, even though it's longer than that, where unfathomable acts of violence, similar to and worse than what happened to Jonathan Lewis, were perpetuated against one demographic of people, specifically because of the color of that demographic of people, then of course in modern day when you see similar things happen, especially with the added context that it's often perpetuated by a police officer, which is where you guys get the looting and rioting from,
They riot, they loot, they burn.
of course one would expect a deeper reaction reason out of it. If we think about this honestly, it's not because of any hypocrisy or any lack of value of the life of people like Jonathan Lewis or white people in general. It's because this is a formula that has repeated itself over and over, with the explicit reasoning being that it was because of the skin color of an individual. So when the similar formula rears its ugly head again, people are going to make the assumption that it has something to do with race, even if we find out later that it doesn't, which is what you hinted at when you brought up the Montgomery boat incident.
Look at the very popular Montgomery brawl. That black man was getting jumped by those racist white men, even though we can't prove that they were actually racist. And then all of those other black men jumped in. Yeah, black power, black excellence. You would never see that with this.
Now, while on the ground, there are conflicting stories about people there hearing the white people say, "Get those N-words" or whatever, and the police not being able to find any concrete evidence that it was racially motivated. Are you so ignorant of history and so ignorant of context that you're unironically asking why people would invoke race in a situation where white people jumped a black person who wasn't doing anything and beat him up in Montgomery, Alabama, in the United States of all places? You genuinely believe that that question could be asked in one scenario and not in the Jonathan Lewis scenario, not because of all of the historical context, but because of some perceived hypocrisy? If you wanted a society where either A, the same question of hate crime or not could be applied to white or black people equally, or B, no question of race would be risen at all, then maybe we shouldn't have had an entire history that weaponized the concept of race specifically against black people that caused people to ask that question only when it's a scenario in which a minority is involved. You guys just feign ignorance as if none of that shit matters or exists to you. But let's move to the final level, level 3. Are any of these people even fucking correct about their analysis? And that's where it gets funny, because it's not just the history that causes us to ask this question. The shit still happens today. Turns out that the worst month for anti-black hate crimes since the FBI started recording it in 1991 was June 2020, in the middle of the burning and rioting and looting that you guys complain about, which means that even when it was known and black people were making a fuss about it, still didn't stop it from happening. The last highest level of anti-black hate crimes happened to be 2008, the year that Barack Obama was elected. Even after electing the first black president, still didn't stop it from happening. And today, black people are still the top targets of hate crimes. So yes, if the races were reversed in the same scenario, the reason why people would question as to whether or not it was a hate crime is because that's a perfectly normal question to ask, considering the history and current day of the United States. You invoked looting and rioting as if to call back to the 2020 protests, but let's not let high-profile instances distract you from what's going on. The repeated instances of police killing unarmed black people that year created a unique set of circumstances, but when we look at homicides as a whole and how it's reported in the media for black people as opposed to white people, according to this study, this is just the tip of the iceberg. After analyzing the 726 homicides that happened in Chicago in 2016 and over 2,000 articles written on each homicide, black victims received 2.8 news articles each versus 3.8 news articles each for white victims and 2.6 for Hispanic victims. White people were also more likely to be discussed as actual complex human beings with relationships as opposed to black and Hispanic people. The authors also analyzed the racial composition of the neighborhoods in which the homicides happened. Turns out that you're more likely to get a news story if it happened in a predominantly white neighborhood, regardless of the race of the person who was actually killed. And in this study, they accounted for the disproportionate murder rates in white communities as opposed to black communities. And white people's deaths still got more nuanced treatment and more coverage. So while that means instances like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd happen and they result in these big upheavals, but on a day-to-day and media representation, white people get more of it when they are victims of homicide as opposed to black people. And when black people do get coverage, there's a palpable difference. Notice that you guys only ever talk about the rioting and looting that happened when the protests overall were 94% peaceful. Notice how when people like Trayvon Martin or Tamir Rice were killed, we still heard negative stories about their life and what they should have done differently. But in this instance, as it rightfully should be, not a single negative thing was mentioned about Jonathan Lewis. But how the media represents and skews deaths of people doesn't ever matter unless you can take the death of a white kid and use it to chastise the entire black community while calling them things like basketball Americans. But intellectual honesty is not as profitable or enticing, I guess, as using every single possible instance to make black people look bad despite shit not having anything to do with them. Rest in peace to Jonathan Lewis, and I hope his father and his family gets the justice they deserve. And all of you who weaponize this as if you genuinely gave a fuck made me sick. Good